I was sitting in my office, coffee getting cold in my hands, when the call came through. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late October, the kind of day where you're not really paying attention to much of anything, because you're caught up in work emails and meetings that could have been emails. My name is David, and I'm 42 years old, a logistics manager for a distribution company in the Midwest. I've got a steady job, steady life, the kind of life where big things don't really happen, or at least they didn't until 3 weeks earlier when my younger brother Martin got married. It was supposed to be a good day, one of those milestone moments where the family comes together and everyone pretends they're closer than they actually are. But nothing about that day was simple, even though I didn't know it at the time. I thought it was just a wedding, just a regular Saturday where my brother was marrying a woman named Sarah, who nobody really knew all that well but who seemed nice enough. We were all there, my parents, my sister, her kids, aunts and uncles scattered throughout the church pews, and there was this videographer named Michael, who had been hired to capture the whole thing. He was professional, quiet, seemed to know what he was doing. He had this camera that probably cost more than my car, and he moved through the reception capturing moments, smiling faces, first dances, all the stuff that wedding videos are made of. I remember thinking he was good at his job. He had this way of disappearing into the background so people forgot he was there and just acted natural. That's the mark of someone who does what they do really well. But that's the thing about cameras, about footage, about preserved moments. Sometimes they see things we don't want seen. Sometimes they catch the things that happen in the corners, the moments when people think nobody's looking, and that's exactly what happened here. The phone rang and I almost didn't answer it. I almost just let it go to voicemail because I was in the middle of something, some spreadsheet that needed my attention. But something made me pick up. Maybe it was the tone of the caller ID, maybe it was instinct. The voice on the other end was Michael, the videographer from the wedding. I recognized his voice immediately. I hadn't talked to him since that Saturday, and it had been a few weeks. There was something different about how he sounded, though. There was urgency there. There was concern. He said my name first, asked if this was a good time to talk. I told him sure, even though it wasn't really. I was still working. But the way he asked made me sit back in my chair. He said he was calling because he'd been editing the wedding footage and he'd found something. He said something like, "Sir, I found something while editing the footage. I know this is going to sound strange, but you'll want to know about this before anyone else sees it. You won't want others to see this first." The way he said it made my stomach do a flip. I asked him what he meant. He wouldn't tell me over the phone. He just kept saying he needed to show me in person, that I needed to see it with my own eyes. He said it wasn't his place to tell me what was on the footage, that I needed to see it and come to my own conclusions. That kind of thing will make your mind race. It will make you immediately start thinking of worst-case scenarios. Your brother falling during the first dance, someone getting sick, some kind of disaster that was captured on film. My mind went to a lot of dark places in those few seconds before I agreed to meet with him. So that's how I found myself setting up a meeting with a videographer I barely knew to watch footage from my brother's wedding. My brother Martin was 7 years younger than me. We weren't particularly close, not in the way some siblings are. We didn't have that bond where you talk all the time and share everything, or have inside jokes that nobody else understands. We had the kind of relationship where you see each other at family events, exchange pleasantries, ask about work, and then move on with your lives. There was no animosity there, nothing like that. We just didn't have that much in common. Growing up, he was always the younger brother I had to look out for sometimes, but once we became adults, we just sort of drifted into our own separate lives. He was more of a free spirit, always bouncing from one thing to the next, one job to another, one relationship to another, one city to another. I was more stable, more traditional, I guess. I like knowing where I stand in life. I like routine. I like being able to plan ahead. Martin, on the other hand, liked chaos and adventure and spontaneity. He'd call on a Friday and say he was moving to Denver. Then 3 months later, he'd call and say he was moving back. He'd quit a job on a whim because the manager was annoying. He'd date someone for a few months and then break up with them because they wanted different things. It was just how we were wired differently, fundamentally different in our approaches to life. Our parents loved us both equally, or at least they tried to make it seem that way. But I think deep down they were a little bit worried about Martin. He had that quality where you could see him struggling against expectations, struggling against what people wanted him to be, struggling to figure out his place in the world. He wanted to be an artist, or a musician, or a photographer, or a filmmaker, or any number of creative things that he was passionate about. But he was also practical enough to know that those things were hard careers, that they didn't pay well, that they were risky. So he bounced around instead. He worked in restaurants as a line cook, and then as a sous chef for a brief moment when it looked like he might make it in the culinary world. He worked in retail at a few different places. He worked in construction for a bit, building houses with a contractor. He lived in different cities trying to find where he belonged. He dated different women, different types of women, trying to figure out what he wanted in a partner, and then about 2 years ago he met Sarah. She worked in marketing for a tech company downtown. She had a good job, a steady income, seemed to have her life together in a way that Martin had never really managed. He was accomplished and driven and ambitious. She was almost his complete opposite, which I think was actually part of the attraction for him. Sarah grounded him in a way nobody else ever had. She gave him structure. She encouraged him to think about his future. She supported his creative interests but also pushed him to be practical. And when he proposed to her last year, nobody was really surprised. It felt like the natural progression of things. Like Martin was finally settling down, finally finding his place, finally figuring out who he was supposed to be and what he wanted his life to look like. Our parents were absolutely thrilled. I was happy for him, genuinely. It wasn't the most exciting wedding proposal or the most romantic moment, and it wasn't like they were this passionate the couple you'd read about in romance novels. It was steady and practical, and it seemed right for both of them. They seemed compatible in that way where you think they're actually going to make it work long term. So when the wedding was planned, everyone was on board. Everyone was happy. Or at least we thought we were. We thought this was a good thing, a positive development. My little brother finally getting his act together. The wedding day itself was clear and bright. One of those September days that feels like fall is about to happen, but summer is still hanging on. The kind of day that makes everything feel like it's exactly how it should be. The ceremony was at 2 p.m. at St. Catherine's, this old church in downtown Milwaukee that my parents had gotten married in 30 years earlier. It had these beautiful stained glass windows that cast coloured light across the pews. The whole place smelled like flowers and old wood and something vaguely religious, if that makes sense. My sister Rebecca was a bridesmaid along with 2 of Sarah's friends. I was an usher, which mostly meant I sat in front and tried to look dignified. I walked my mother down the aisle since my father was helping my mother into her seat on the other side. Martin looked nervous, which is normal. He was standing there at the altar in a suit that probably made him uncomfortable, adjusting his tie every few seconds, running his hand through his hair. I could see the stress on his face, the way his jaw was clenched, the way he kept glancing around like he was looking for an escape route. But then the organist changed the music and everyone stood up and Sarah started down the aisle, and something changed in Martin. His whole expression softened, his jaw unclenched. He actually smiled. This genuine smile that I hadn't seen on his face in years, maybe not since we were kids. And in that moment, looking at my brother, looking at his bride, I thought maybe this was it. Maybe this was what he needed. Maybe Sarah was the one who was going to help him figure out who he was supposed to be. But I also remember noticing something else in that moment. I noticed Rebecca watching them. She was standing there in her bridesmaid dress, this soft blue colour, and she was watching Martin look at Sarah with that smile, and something flickered across her face. I didn't think much about it at the time. It was just a moment, a brief moment. She smiled, and then it was gone. The ceremony itself was pretty standard. They exchanged vows that they'd probably written themselves, but that sounded a lot like every other wedding vow. There were readings from people I didn't know very well. My sister cried because that's what she does at weddings. There was the traditional moment where the pastor said, if anyone objects, speak now or forever, hold your peace. And nobody did, which is always anticlimactic because nobody ever does. And then Martin and Sarah were married and everyone clapped and they kissed. And we all filed out of the church into the bright afternoon, out into the sunlight where we all blinked like we were coming out of a cave. The reception was at a venue called the Amber Room, which was this old building downtown that had been converted into an event space. It used to be some kind of department store or something like that, but now it was an empty open space that venues could rent out for events. It had these massive high ceilings and exposed brick walls and huge windows along one wall that overlooked the Milwaukee River. The tables were decorated in gold and white with these simple flower arrangements, nothing too elaborate. There was a string quartet playing during cocktail hour, these classical pieces that sounded sophisticated and nice, though nobody was really paying attention to them. By the time dinner was served and everyone was seated, a DJ had taken over and started playing more upbeat music, the kind of music that gets people in the mood to celebrate. The food was decent, nothing special, standard wedding fare, chicken or fish, your choice, with some vegetables and a side dish that I don't really remember. But nobody was really there for the food anyway. They were there for the celebration, for the milestone, for the chance to drink wine and talk to relatives you only see a couple times a year. That's where Michael the videographer was moving around, capturing moments. He was so unobtrusive that you almost forgot he was there, almost forgot that he was working. He'd be at one table, then at another, then catching the bride and groom doing some kind of formal portrait situation outside the venue on the little terrace. He had this camera on his shoulder and he moved with purpose, like he knew exactly what he was doing. He had this way of appearing and disappearing that was almost like magic. He knew exactly when things were about to happen, and he positioned himself to catch it. I remember at one point during the reception, I was standing near the bar getting a drink, a whiskey on the rocks, and I looked around the room and I noticed Michael catching me watching him work. He gave me a little wave, a professional smile, very polite. I waved back, and then he was gone again, off capturing something else, off documenting the moment. That's the thing that haunts me now looking back on it. He was capturing everything. He saw everything that happened in that room that day. Every moment, every expression, every exchange between people. And what he saw, what that camera saw, wasn't what any of us thought we were looking at. It wasn't just a celebration. It was something darker. The 3 weeks between the wedding and the phone call were pretty normal for me. Pretty routine. Work was busy as it always is at this time of year. I had a project where we were consolidating 2 distribution centres, closing one and moving all the operations to the other, and it was eating up most of my time. There were logistics to work out, employees to reassign, systems to merge. It was the kind of work that kept you occupied and distracted. I went to the gym a couple times. I had dinner with my girlfriend Sarah, which was funny because my sister-in-law is also named Sarah, but it's a common name, right? We'd gone to dinner at this Italian place we like, nothing fancy, just food and conversation. Life just kept moving forward at its regular pace. Nothing changed. Everything was normal. I didn't think much about Martin or the wedding. I figured they were probably still in the honeymoon phase. Maybe they were on a trip somewhere or settling into married life together. Maybe they were in that phase where you just kind of exist together and figure out how to be married. My parents probably called Martin a few times asking how things were going, but that's what parents do. They stay involved. They want to know what's happening in their children's lives. Nobody really thinks about weddings after they're over, right? They're these big events, and then they're done, and you move on, and life goes back to normal. You go back to work, you go back to your routine, you go back to your regular life. But apparently, while I was doing all of that regular stuff, while I was working on distribution centre logistics and going to the gym and having dinner with my girlfriend, Michael the videographer had been in his editing studio working through footage. He'd been going through hours and hours of video that he'd shot that day, cutting and splicing, arranging it into a coherent final product that he could deliver to my brother. And somewhere in all of that footage, somewhere in all those hours of material, he'd found something that made him feel like he needed to call me specifically. Not my brother Martin, not my parents, me, David. And he wanted to show it to me before anyone else saw it, before it went into the final video, before it became part of the official wedding record. That kind of thing doesn't just happen without reason. That kind of call, that kind of decision by a professional videographer to reach out to a stranger and say he'd found something, means something is wrong. Something is seriously wrong. And when I met with him the following Friday evening to see what he'd found, to see what was on that footage, I realised exactly how wrong things actually were. We met at a coffee shop called the Daily Grind, which seemed like a weird place for Michael to choose, but he said it was near his editing studio and convenient for him. He arrived with a laptop under his arm and this serious expression on his face that looked like he'd been carrying this information around like a weight for days. Like it was something he'd been sitting with and wrestling with and struggling to figure out what to do about. He ordered a coffee, asked for it black, no sugar, and we sat down at a corner table away from the other customers, away from anyone who might overhear. He opened the laptop without much preamble. He was quiet for a long moment, like he was trying to figure out how to say something that couldn't really be said, how to communicate something that was too sensitive, too personal, too potentially devastating. Then he looked at me directly in the eyes and said, "I wasn't going to call you. I wanted to just quietly edit this out of the final video and pretend I never saw it." That felt easier. That felt like the safer choice. But then I realised that would be wrong. You have a right to know what happened at that wedding, what your family should know, what someone should know. His tone was serious, almost professional, but with this undercurrent of genuine concern and maybe even worry. He turned the screen toward me and hit play. The footage started, and I saw the interior of the amber room, the reception in full swing. Guests were mingling. The DJ was playing some kind of upbeat song that I remembered from that day, the kind of song that gets people excited and energized. The camera was pointed at Martin and Sarah as they made their way through the room, greeting people, doing that thing that newlyweds do where they try to spend a moment with everyone. Everything looked normal. Everything looked the way weddings are supposed to look. There was joy in the air, there was celebration, there was lightness and happiness. But then Michael did something with the footage. He scrubbed through it, moved it ahead quickly using the timeline at the bottom, fast-forwarding through moments, and then pointed at a specific moment with his index finger. He said, "Watch what happens here. Watch what happens when you look at the left side of the frame." This is about 45 minutes into the reception, during that moment when Martin and Sarah were doing their thing with the guests, greeting relatives and friends. I leaned in close to the screen and watched. The camera was on Martin and Sarah, capturing them greeting someone's elderly relatives, smiling, shaking hands, doing the polite thing that people do at weddings. But on the periphery of the frame there was my sister Rebecca, standing with her boyfriend Marcus against the wall near one of the windows. And what I saw in that moment, what Michael had caught on film with his expensive camera, and his professional eye for detail, was something that changed everything. Without meaning to, without ever intending for anyone to know, without the slightest awareness that a camera was pointed in her direction, my sister was captured in a moment of pure heartbreak. She was watching Martin and Sarah together, her boyfriend's arm around her waist, and our face showed something I had never expected to see, never wanted to see. It showed pain, it showed longing, it showed a depth of emotion that suggested my sister had been harbouring feelings she had no right harbouring, feelings she had no business feeling, feelings that made no sense and yet made terrible, horrible sense at the same time. Rebecca was looking at Martin with something more than sisterly affection. It wasn't just casual family love, it was something deeper, something more complicated. And when she glanced at Sarah, when her eyes flickered from Martin to his new wife, there was a flash of something that looked almost like jealousy, almost like resentment, almost like envy. Michael paused the footage right there, right on that moment, freezing Rebecca's face on screen. He let me stare at it for a few seconds before he spoke. He looked at me and said quietly, "You see what I mean? You see what I call?" I did see what he meant. I saw exactly what he meant. And what he meant was that my sister had been harbouring feelings for my new brother-in-law, feelings for Martin. My brother's wife was standing right there in frame, my brother was right there, and my sister was looking at him like she wanted something she couldn't have and never would have, like she was losing something, like she'd lost something. Michael let the footage keep playing then. He unfroze it from that moment and the video continued. Rebecca's expression changed. Her boyfriend Marcus said something to her and she looked away, seemed to refocus on the party around them. She smiled at Marcus, touched his arm, and they both looked back at the reception. But I could see it was forced. I could see that she was trying to pull herself together, trying to act like nothing was wrong. Michael scrubbed ahead again and said, "There's more. Throughout the whole reception, I keep catching these moments. It's subtle, but it's there once you see it. You start to notice it." He showed me another clip. This one was during the first dance. Martin and Sarah were out on the makeshift dance floor, slow, dancing to some sappy love song, and the camera panned through the crowd watching them. There was Rebecca again, watching them, and her expression was different this time. It was harder to read. There was something almost angry in it, or maybe frustrated, or maybe both. The more Michael showed me, the more I realised how much Rebecca had been struggling during that reception. How much she'd been trying to hide something that was literally tearing her apart. Michael closed the laptop finally and looked at me seriously. He said, "I didn't know what to do with this. I still don't really know. My job is to make a beautiful video of the wedding, and this kind of thing, these feelings, these emotions that aren't supposed to be there, they're not usually part of what people want captured. But I thought you should know. I thought someone in your family should know what I'd documented before the final video goes out." He paused and took a sip of his coffee, which had probably gotten cold by now. I was sitting there staring at the closed laptop, trying to process what I'd just seen, trying to make sense of it. My sister Rebecca had feelings for my brother Martin. Real, genuine, complicated feelings, and she'd been harbouring them while Martin married Sarah, while my sister stood there as a bridesmaid, watching her brother marry someone else, knowing that she had these feelings that she shouldn't have. It didn't make sense, or it made too much sense. I didn't want to believe it. I wanted to think that maybe Michael had misinterpreted what he'd captured, that maybe he'd read too much into expressions, into normal wedding day emotions. But I knew better. I'd seen Rebecca's face. I'd seen what was there. The question was, what did it mean? What was I supposed to do with this information? What did Michael expect me to do with it? I sat there for what felt like a long time, though it probably wasn't more than a minute or two. Time does that weird thing when you're processing something that doesn't fit into the way you understand the world, stretches out, it becomes elastic. Michael was waiting for me to say something, waiting for some kind of reaction, and I didn't have one ready. My brain was still trying to catch up to what my eyes had seen on that screen. Rebecca, my sister. Rebecca, who I'd known my whole life, who I'd changed diapers for when she was a baby, who I'd helped with her homework in high school, who I'd listened to complain about boyfriends and work problems and all the normal things that come with being a sibling. She had feelings for Martin, not the kind of feelings you're supposed to have for your brother, the kind that make everything complicated and wrong and impossible, and somehow that videographer had captured it, had documented it without even trying to, had caught the thing my sister never wanted anyone to see. I looked at Michael and asked him what he wanted me to do with this. He seemed uncomfortable with the question. I could see he'd wrestled with it before calling me. He said his intention wasn't to create drama or blow up my family. He was just uncomfortable having this information and deciding to ignore it. His words were something like, "I have a sister too. If this were happening in my family, I'd want to know. Someone would need to know. So I'm telling you because I don't know who else to tell." I appreciated that, even though every part of me wanted him to have just quietly edited it out and let me live in blissful ignorance. Instead, he was taking responsibility for what he'd seen and passing that responsibility to me. Which made sense because I was part of the family. I was the one who would have to figure out what came next. I asked if he'd shown this to anyone else. He said no, just me. He'd considered calling my parents but thought it might create a disaster. He'd thought about contacting Rebecca, but that seemed worse, so he'd landed on me. He gave me the full file on a USB drive. He said, "Take this, do whatever you think is right. I'm washing my hands of it now, but I wanted you to know," and he wasn't wrong. Even though it felt like he was handing me a grenade and walking away. Now I had the footage. Now I had to decide what to do with the knowledge that my sister had been standing at my brother's wedding, watching him marry someone else, while harbouring feelings she shouldn't have been harbouring. I left the coffee shop with that USB drive in my pocket and a mind that felt like it was going in about 17 different directions at once. I drove to my office because I didn't know where else to go. I didn't want to go home to my apartment where my girlfriend Sarah was probably waiting for me. I didn't want to have to explain where I'd been or why I was in a weird mood. I didn't want to have to pretend everything was normal when everything suddenly felt anything but normal. My office was empty. It was a Friday evening and most people had left for the day. I locked the door and booted up my computer and put the USB drive in the port. The files were there, video files with timestamps. Michael had organised them, labelled them, made it easy for me to find the specific moments he'd been talking about. I pulled them up and watched again. Watched Rebecca watch Martin and Sarah. Watched my sister's face as she realised the wedding was happening, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. There was nothing she could do to change what was happening. Watched her try to mask it, try to push it down, try to act like everything was fine. And I sat there in my office with all the lights off except for the glow from the monitor, and I tried to figure out what this meant. How long had Rebecca had these feelings? Had they started recently or had they been brewing for years? Did Martin know? Did Sarah know? Did anyone else know? My parents certainly didn't seem to know. They would have said something if they'd known. They would have been concerned. They would have tried to intervene. Or maybe they didn't know and that was part of the problem. Maybe nobody knew. Maybe Rebecca had been carrying this around by herself. This thing that nobody else understood. This complication that didn't make sense and couldn't be resolved. I called Michael's studio number and got his voicemail. I left a message thanking him for what he'd done, acknowledging that it was the right call to tell me, letting him know that I'd figure out what to do next. Then I sat there with the files open in front of me and tried to think about what came next. The first thing I did was back up everything onto my personal drive. Michael had made it easy for me, but I didn't want to lose access to what he'd given me. I didn't want to rely on that USB drive in case it got damaged or lost. So I copied all the files multiple times, made sure I had redundant copies so that if something happened, if somehow this information got lost, I'd still have it. I wasn't sure why I was doing that. Maybe because I was thinking like a logistics manager, thinking about backup systems and redundancy and making sure critical information didn't disappear. Or maybe because some part of me understood that this information was going to become important, was going to become central to whatever came next, and I needed to make sure it was preserved. I watched the footage again that night at home. My girlfriend Sarah was asleep by the time I got back to my apartment around midnight. She'd left a plate of food in the fridge with a note that said, "I hope your meeting went well." I heated up the food and ate it without tasting it, and then I went to my home office and pulled up the files on my laptop and I watched Rebecca watch her brother marry someone else. I watched it over and over. I rewound to the same moments and watched them again. I was looking for details I'd missed, signs of when this had started or how deep it went. The more I watched, the more I realized I'd been blind to something right in front of me. I went through my memories of recent interactions with Rebecca. There was a time a few months ago when she'd asked a lot of questions about Martin. What he was doing, whether he seemed happy with Sarah. I'd thought it was normal sister interest, but now I wondered if it was more. Rebecca wasn't the type to openly talk about her feelings. She was private, guarded. So if she'd been harbouring these feelings, she would have buried them deep. I called my mother and asked when Rebecca and Martin had started spending more time together. She seemed confused. She said they'd always been closer siblings. Had she noticed anything unusual? My mother said no. Rebecca seemed fine. She had her boyfriend Marcus, was doing well at work. Nothing seemed off. But my mother wouldn't necessarily notice something like that. She had her own concerns. She wasn't paying attention to the emotional undercurrents between her children. I knew I had to be more direct eventually. I knew I couldn't just sit with this information and try to figure it out on my own through vague questions and watching footage over and over again. But before I confronted anyone about anything, I wanted to understand the full scope of what I was dealing with. I wanted to know the timeline. I wanted to know how long Rebecca had felt this way. I wanted to know if this was a recent development or if it was something that had been festering for years beneath the surface. So I did something I'm not particularly proud of. I started doing some digging into Rebecca's life. I looked back at her social media posts going back a couple years. She wasn't one of those people who posted constantly, but she posted occasionally. Photos from work events, photos from vacations, photos of her and Marcus. I was looking for context clues. I was looking for moments where she'd posted about Martin, or commented on his life, or seemed particularly invested in what he was doing. There was a post from about 18 months ago where Rebecca had posted a photo of her and Martin at a family dinner. She'd written a caption that said something like, "So grateful for my brother. He's always been there for me." It was a normal post. It was the kind of thing people post about siblings all the time, but I started wondering if there was something more behind it. I started wondering if maybe by that point, Rebecca had already started feeling something different toward Martin. I scrolled through more posts. I looked at comments she'd made on Martin's social media. He didn't post much, but when he did, Rebecca usually commented. She'd like his photos. She'd leave encouraging comments about his various endeavours. It all seemed normal on the surface. It all seemed like what a sister does. But now I was reading it through a different lens. Now I was wondering if there was subtext to everything she'd said to him, or about him. I started thinking about the history between them. Rebecca was 5 years younger than Martin. When they were kids, Martin had been the older brother who teased her and looked out for her and helped her with things. She'd looked up to him. That's normal for siblings with that age gap. But at what point had something shifted? At what point did that normal sibling admiration cross over into something else? I didn't have an answer to that. I didn't have a clear moment where I could point to and say, there. That's when it changed. It seemed like it had probably been gradual. It seemed like the kind of thing that built up over time, slowly, without anyone really noticing it was happening, the way feelings often do. One day you're just a sister looking up to her older brother. The next day you realise you're looking at him as something more, and you can't unfeel that feeling. You can't just turn it back off and go back to the way things were. I looked further back. I found emails between Rebecca and Martin from about 4 years ago. She'd been living in another city at that time and they'd kept in touch through email. I know, looking at those emails now feels invasive, but I was trying to understand the timeline of when this had shifted, when the normal sibling relationship had become something else. In those emails, Rebecca had been helping Martin through a rough patch. He'd been dealing with depression. He'd been questioning his career choices. He'd been struggling with the idea that he was 30 years old and didn't have his life figured out the way he thought he would by that age. And Rebecca had been there for him. She'd written these long, thoughtful emails about how he was a good person and how his struggle was valid and how he'd figure things out eventually. She'd been supportive and loving and present in a way that seemed to go beyond normal sibling support. The language she'd used was careful but intimate. There was a tenderness there that made me understand, looking back on it, that somewhere during that time something had shifted in her feelings toward him. It wasn't sexual exactly, or at least not in an obvious way. It was more about emotional intimacy and connection and a deep understanding of another person. It was the kind of closeness that you're supposed to have with a romantic partner, not with your brother. But Rebecca had invested that kind of emotional energy into Martin, and somewhere along the way, her feelings had evolved into something more complicated. I spent that whole weekend going through information, going through memories, trying to piece together a timeline that might make sense. By Sunday evening, I'd convinced myself that I needed to talk to Rebecca directly. I needed to ask her about this. I needed to hear her explanation, hear her side of the story, understand what was really going on in her head. I couldn't just sit with this information forever. Eventually it was going to come out, and when it did, I wanted to have already had some kind of conversation about it with her. I wanted her to know that I knew. I wanted to give her the chance to explain before anyone else found out. So I called Rebecca on Monday afternoon. I told her I wanted to meet with her. I said I had something I needed to discuss with her, and it was important. She sounded nervous on the phone. She asked me if everything was okay. I told her everything was fine, I just needed to talk to her. I asked if she could meet me for lunch on Tuesday. She said yes, she could do that. We met at this place we sometimes went to, this restaurant near where we both worked. It was a nice enough place, casual, not too loud, a good place to have a conversation. Rebecca looked anxious when she got there. She kept asking me what was going on. She wanted to know if something was wrong. Was something wrong with our parents? Was something wrong with Martin? Was she in trouble somehow? I told her nobody was in trouble. I told her I just needed to talk to her about something sensitive and I needed her to be honest with me. We ordered food, and then I told her that I'd seen the wedding footage. I told her that the videographer had found something and had shown it to me. I told her that I knew how she felt about Martin. I said it all very carefully, very gently, because I wasn't trying to ambush her or attack her. I was trying to have a conversation about something that was clearly causing her pain. Rebecca's face went completely white when I said it. For a long moment, she didn't say anything. She just stared at me like she was trying to process what I'd just told her. Then she got up from the table. She just stood up without saying anything, and she walked out of the restaurant. I sat there alone with the food that was just arriving, and I realized I'd made a mistake. I'd approached this wrong. I'd been too direct. I'd shocked her, and now she was running, and I didn't know what came next. I threw some money down on the table and followed her out to the parking lot. She was standing by her car, her hands shaking. She turned around when she heard me coming. Her eyes were filled with tears. She asked me how I could have done this to her, how I could have looked at something so private and so personal and then confronted her about it, like we were discussing her poor performance review at work. I told her I wasn't trying to hurt her. I told her I was trying to help. I told her I needed to understand what was really going on, because having this information without context was driving me crazy. She leaned against her car and she started crying. She said I didn't understand. I couldn't possibly understand. She said it wasn't something she'd chosen. It wasn't something she was proud of. It was just something that had happened and she'd been dealing with it on her own for a long time. She asked me if I remembered when Martin went through his bad period a few years ago, when he was depressed and confused and struggling with who he was and what he wanted out of life. She said she'd been there for him during that time. She'd listened to him. She'd been the one he'd called when he couldn't talk to anyone else. And somewhere during that process, somewhere during all those conversations and all that emotional intimacy, something had shifted in her. She'd developed real feelings for him. Serious feelings. And she'd known it was wrong. She'd known it was inappropriate. But she couldn't make those feelings go away. I asked her what had happened when Martin met Sarah. Rebecca said that when Martin met Sarah, it felt like losing him. It felt like watching the person she cared about slip into the hands of someone else, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. She said Sarah was fine, Sarah was nice, but Sarah wasn't the right person for Martin. Sarah didn't really understand him the way Rebecca did. Sarah was trying to fix him, trying to make him more conventional, more practical, and that wasn't what Martin needed. Martin needed someone who understood his creative spirit, who supported his wild ideas, who loved him for who he was, not for who they wanted him to be. And Rebecca had realized somewhere in the process of watching Martin fall in love with Sarah, that she was the person who understood him that way. She was the person who loved him for who he was. And because she was his sister, because that was impossible and inappropriate and wrong, she could never tell him any of that. She could never act on it. She could never do anything but watch him build a life with someone else and pretend that her heart wasn't breaking. I stood there listening to my sister talk about her feelings for our brother, and I realized that this was more complicated than I'd thought. This wasn't just about Rebecca having an awkward crush. This was about genuine emotional connection. This was about my sister having developed real, deep feelings for someone she couldn't have, and my sister had been dealing with this alone for years. She'd been carrying this around and trying to manage it without anyone knowing, and Michael the videographer had accidentally exposed it, and now the secret was out, and everything had changed. But then Rebecca said something that shifted the entire conversation. She said there was more to it than just her feelings. She said it wasn't just about romantic love or emotional intimacy or any of the things I'd been thinking about. She said it was also about protecting Martin, and when she said that, the tone of her voice changed. It became harder, more defensive, more urgent. She said there were things about Sarah that nobody else knew, things that concerned her deeply, things that made her worry about Martin's safety and well-being. She'd been trying to figure out how to tell him, how to warn him, how to help him see what she was seeing, but she couldn't do it without sounding crazy, without sounding like she was motivated by jealousy rather than genuine concern. She asked me if I'd ever noticed anything off about Sarah, if I'd ever seen anything that made me uncomfortable. I told her no. I told her Sarah seemed fine to me, she seemed like a nice person. But Rebecca shook her head. She said I wasn't paying attention. She said if I actually looked at the way Sarah treated Martin, if I actually paid attention to their interactions, I would see things that would concern me too. She said Sarah was controlling. Sarah had systematically isolated Martin from his friends. Sarah had convinced him to give up pursuing certain creative projects because she said they were too risky. Sarah had made him question his own judgment and his own instincts about what he wanted in life, and Rebecca said she'd watched it happen slowly over the course of their relationship, and she'd been terrified about what would happen once they got married, which of course they already had. They'd already gotten married, and now Rebecca felt like she'd failed to protect her brother from something she genuinely believed was harmful to him. She said it wasn't just about control either. She said there had been times when Sarah's behavior had seemed almost abusive, not physically but emotionally, psychologically. She said she'd heard Martin on the phone trying to explain things to Sarah, and Sarah saying things that made him sound smaller, less confident, less like himself. And Rebecca said that was why she couldn't just let go of her feelings, because her feelings had become intertwined with a genuine concern for Martin's well-being. She felt responsible for him. She felt like she needed to protect him, and not being able to do that was tearing her apart from the inside. I asked her if she had any concrete examples. She hesitated. She said it was hard to explain because it was more about patterns and tones and the way Sarah treated him when they thought nobody was watching. But then she mentioned something specific. She said that about 3 months ago, Martin had wanted to apply for a freelance photography gig that he was really interested in. It was a legitimate opportunity with a decent company. But when he told Sarah about it, Sarah had convinced him it was too unstable. She said it would derail their plans for a secure financial future. She said they couldn't afford for him to take risks like that. And according to Rebecca, Sarah had been so persistent about it, so negative about the opportunity, that Martin had ended up not applying. And Rebecca said that was when she realized something was really wrong. Because Martin had always been someone who needed to take risks. He needed to pursue creative things, and Sarah was systematically eliminating those opportunities from his life. And what concerned Rebecca most was that Martin seemed to be accepting it. He seemed to be internalizing Sarah's messaging and starting to believe that he couldn't pursue the things he wanted, that it was selfish of him to even try. I was standing in that parking lot listening to my sister explain all of this, and I felt like the ground was shifting beneath my feet, because what Rebecca was describing sounded serious. It sounded like psychological manipulation and control. And I realized that maybe Rebecca's feelings for Martin weren't just about romantic love at all. Maybe they were about genuine concern. Maybe the romantic feelings were almost secondary to this fear that he was in a harmful relationship, and she was powerless to stop it. She couldn't tell him she was worried about Sarah without sounding jealous. She couldn't confront Sarah without it seeming like she was being territorial. So she'd just been watching and waiting and hoping that Martin would see what she was seeing. And the wedding had happened anyway, and now she was terrified about what came next. I asked Rebecca what she wanted me to do with all of this. She said she wanted me to watch them. She wanted me to pay attention to the way Sarah treated Martin. She wanted me to see if I noticed the same patterns she was seeing, and then, if I saw them too, she wanted me to help her figure out how to approach Martin about it. She said she needed an ally. She said she couldn't do this alone. And I realised right then that I'd been thinking about this entire situation wrong. It wasn't about Rebecca's inappropriate feelings for her brother. It was about Rebecca trying to protect her brother from someone she believed was hurting him. And I'd walked into this conversation thinking I was dealing with one kind of problem when actually I was dealing with something else entirely. I told Rebecca I would help her. I told her I would pay attention to the way Sarah treated Martin. I told her we would figure this out together. And she looked at me with this mixture of relief and worry on her face, like she was grateful that someone finally believed her, but terrified about what might happen next. As I drove home that night, I realised that everything had just become much more complicated than I'd ever imagined. I had to decide what to do with the information Michael had given me. I had to figure out if Rebecca's concerns about Sarah were valid. I had to determine whether I was about to become involved in something that could either protect my brother or destroy my family, or possibly both. There wasn't a clear path forward. There was no instruction manual for this kind of situation. All I had was a USB drive full of wedding footage, a sister who was terrified about her brother's well-being, and the growing realization that nothing about this situation was what it had seemed to be when Michael first called me at my office 3 weeks ago. The next 2 weeks became a strange kind of investigation. I wasn't a detective like my brother seemed to want me to be, but I started paying attention to things I'd previously overlooked. I had Rebecca's warnings in my head, and now every time I saw Martin and Sarah together, I found myself analysing their interaction through that lens. I'd made plans to see them, casual plans, a dinner here, coffee there. I started bringing my girlfriend along to some of these outings, thinking a third party's presence might make observations easier. But what I found was that Sarah's behaviour actually became more pronounced when witnesses were present. It was like she performed a version of control that was just subtle enough that someone not looking for it would miss it entirely. Sarah always seemed pleasant on the surface, friendly. She laughed at jokes and remembered details I'd mentioned weeks before. But there was something underneath it. Something that Rebecca had noticed and now I couldn't unsee once I started looking for it. The way Sarah touched Martin's arm when he started talking about something that interested him. Not a loving touch, a redirecting touch. Like she was steering him, guiding him back to whatever conversation she wanted to have. It happened so smoothly, so naturally, that the first few times I almost didn't register it was happening. But after I saw it once, I saw it everywhere. The way she'd ask him questions in public and then interrupt him before he finished answering. The way she'd make small, cutting comments that sounded like affection on the surface, but carried a barb underneath. "He's always been such a dreamer," she'd say, with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Or Martin gets so passionate about his little projects, but he knows I keep us grounded in reality." And Martin would laugh along, but something in his eyes seemed dimmed. Like he'd heard these assessments of himself so many times that he'd started to believe them, like he'd internalized the criticism and turned it into some kind of truth about who he was. I started keeping notes. Not in any formal way, but I'd go home after seeing them and I'd write down observations. I'd jot down times and quotes and behaviours. Nothing that looked like evidence exactly, but a record of patterns. The incident at dinner when Martin mentioned wanting to take a photography class with a professional he admired. He'd been genuinely excited about it. I could see it in his face. He talked about what this photographer had done, what techniques he wanted to learn, how this could potentially lead to him building a freelance business on the side. It was the most animated I'd seen him in months. But Sarah had immediately shut it down. She said they couldn't afford it right now, even though I happened to know Martin had savings. She'd been present when he'd mentioned his savings account last month. She knew exactly how much money he had set aside. She said they needed to be responsible. She said they were planning to buy a house and every dollar mattered. She said it wasn't the right time for hobbies. She said hobbies were luxuries for people without goals. Martin had nodded and agreed, and that was that. I watched him put the idea away like he was folding up a piece of paper and filing it somewhere deep inside himself. I watched him diminish his own desires in real time, saw him accept Sarah's framework for why his interest didn't matter. It was subtle enough that if you weren't looking for it, you wouldn't see it. But once you were looking for it, it became impossible to miss. It was like someone had turned on a light and I could suddenly see all the small ways she was systematically convincing him that his dreams were unreasonable and his wants were selfish. About a week and a half into this observation, I talked to my mother. I called her up pretending to ask about a recipe, but really fishing for information about Sarah's behaviour toward Martin. My mother paused. She said she'd always felt something was off, but couldn't articulate it. She said Sarah had a way of looking at Martin when he wasn't paying attention, like she was assessing him. My mother had dismissed it as paranoia until I asked. She wondered if she'd been right all along. I invited Martin to drinks without Sarah. He hesitated, said Sarah didn't like him going out alone. Not forbidden exactly, but he didn't like leaving her. I pressed and he agreed, though he seemed nervous. At the bar, I asked directly how things were with Sarah. He gave the standard answer. Good, great, settling in. But when I asked if he felt controlled, he got defensive. He said Sarah just wanted a stable future. Strong opinions, sure, but from love. He said every relationship had one practical partner, and that was her, and it wasn't bad. He said I didn't understand her yet, but I would. And I realised that moment how systematically Sarah had gaslit him. He'd internalised her criticisms and started parroting them back when I raised concerns. This was worse than I'd thought. I called Rebecca and told her everything I'd observed. She listened carefully and then she said she wanted to talk to Martin herself. She said she couldn't do it alone anymore, and now that I was on board, now that I'd seen the patterns too, maybe we could approach him together. I told her I didn't think that was a good idea. I said confronting him wasn't going to make him listen to us. It was going to put him on the defensive. It was going to make him feel attacked, and he'd probably just run straight to Sarah and tell her what we'd said, and then Sarah would use it against him to further isolate him from us. Rebecca said then, what were we supposed to do? Just let him stay in a toxic relationship and slowly lose himself? I told her we needed to be smarter about this. We needed to present evidence, not accusations. We needed to make him see it on his own rather than telling him he was being controlled. Rebecca didn't like it, but she agreed to give it another week. That week gave me time to plan an approach. I thought about what would actually get through to Martin, what would make him question Sarah's behaviour and actually listen to the concerns being raised. I came to the conclusion that I couldn't go to him alone. Rebecca had a right to be part of this, but bringing her would immediately trigger Sarah's isolation tactics. So I decided to frame it differently. I'd ask Martin to meet me and bring his wife. I'd make it seem casual. I'd ask them both out to dinner under the pretext of celebrating a work achievement of mine. And then, once we were all there and we were a few drinks in, I'd find a way to raise the concerns. I'd be gentle about it. I'd frame it as something I'd been thinking about, something that was troubling me, and I wanted to talk through it with both of them. The night of the dinner arrived and I was more nervous than I'd expected. I hadn't slept well the night before. I'd been rehearsing what I wanted to say in my head, trying to find the right words that would communicate my concerns without making it sound like I was attacking Sarah or criticising Martin's choices. I knew this could go one of two ways. Either they'd listen and Martin would see what I was seeing, or they'd close ranks and I'd have made things worse. I picked the restaurant carefully, somewhere nice enough that Sarah would be on her best behaviour, but informal enough that a serious conversation didn't feel completely out of place. I wanted neutral ground, somewhere neither of them would feel like they were being ambushed. They arrived about 10 minutes after I did. Sarah looked beautiful in a black dress. She had this composed elegance about her, the kind of thing that made you believe she had everything figured out. Martin looked uncomfortable. He kept checking his phone like he was looking for an escape route. I'd reserved a private booth in the back, which turned out to be a good choice because I suspected this conversation was going to be intense. We ordered wine and food and made small talk for a while. The appetizers came. We talked about their new apartment. Sarah had decorated it, apparently, and done a really nice job. She went into detail about the colour scheme and the furniture choices and the overall aesthetic vision. Martin chimed in occasionally, but mostly deferred to Sarah's descriptions. He'd agree with her assessments. He'd add minor details that supported what she was saying. I was studying both of them, looking for tells, for moments where the mask might slip. Looking for moments where Martin might express an opinion that deviated from Sarah's narrative. I didn't see many. After the main course arrived, I made my opening move. I said there was something I'd been wanting to talk to them about, and I appreciated them both being here because it involved both of them. Sarah's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, just a tightening around her eyes, a slight change in her posture, like someone had flipped a switch and she'd gone into a different mode. Martin looked confused. He seemed to sense that something was about to happen but couldn't quite figure out what. I pressed forward. I said I'd been spending more time with them recently, and I'd noticed some patterns in their relationship that were concerning me. I said I was raising this out of love, not judgment. I said I cared about both of them, and I wouldn't be saying anything if I didn't think it was important. Sarah immediately started defending herself. She said if this was about her being practical with money, she didn't think that was a fair criticism. Martin had agreed to their financial plans. She said if I didn't like the way she managed their life together, I was welcome to keep my opinions to myself. She said this all with a smile, but her voice had turned cold underneath. There was an edge to it now, something sharp that hadn't been there moments before. I told her I wasn't talking about their finances. I said I was talking about the way she seemed to discourage Martin's personal interests and creative pursuits. I said I'd noticed her telling him his photography hobby was a waste of time. I'd noticed her making jokes about his dreams in public. I'd noticed her making him feel small when he expressed interest that didn't align with her vision of their future, and I noticed she did all of this while framing it as care and concern. I said I was worried about him. I said I was worried that he was losing parts of himself. I said I'd watched him get smaller with each comment she made, each dismissal of his interests, each time she made him feel like his desires were selfish or foolish. Martin's face went red. He started talking over me, saying I had no right to come to dinner with them and start criticizing his wife. He said Sarah had every right to express her opinions about their life together. He said relationships involved compromise and Sarah was just being realistic. He said maybe if I'd ever been in a serious relationship I'd understand how things actually worked. He said I was being judgmental and unfair. He said Sarah cared about him, and if I cared about him, I'd support her decisions too. I told him this wasn't compromise. This was one person systematically dismantling another person's sense of self. This was making someone feel bad about wanting things, about having interests, about being their own person. Sarah leaned over and grabbed Martin's hand. She squeezed it gently. She said it was okay. She said she understood why I was confused about what we had together because I didn't really know her. She said I was outside their relationship looking in, and I couldn't possibly understand the dynamics they created together. She said once he got past his attachment to his family, once he stopped letting his family's opinions undermine our partnership, he'd understand that she was the only one he really needed, that she was the one who truly supported him, that she was the one who had his best interest at heart. That statement hung in the air between us, and I realized what I was looking at. This wasn't just controlling behavior. This was someone deliberately trying to isolate my brother from his entire family and support system. This was intentional, calculated. This was textbook psychological abuse, and my brother was sitting right here in front of me accepting it as love. I told Sarah directly that what she'd just said scared me. I said it sounded like she was trying to cut Martin off from everyone who could challenge her version of reality. I said that was textbook abusive behavior. I said that was isolation, and it wasn't healthy, and it wasn't love no matter how she tried to frame it. Sarah's face went completely blank for a moment, and then her expression hardened into something cold and unfamiliar. She stood up from the table. She said she wasn't going to sit here and be insulted by someone who didn't know anything about their relationship. She said Martin had always had a difficult relationship with his family, and she was simply supporting his process of creating healthy boundaries. She said a lot of families were toxic and codependent, and sometimes people needed to step back to heal. She said Martin appreciated her support in that process. She turned to Martin and asked him if he was going to let me talk to her like that. She asked if he was going to let his family disrespect and demean her. She looked at him like she was genuinely hurt, like I'd done something terrible to her. For a moment I thought Martin might actually stand up for himself. I thought he might see the manipulation for what it was. I thought he might recognize that Sarah was reframing everything I'd said, turning my concerns into an attack on her, making it seem like I was the bad guy for caring about him. But then something shifted in his face. The doubt I'd seen earlier got replaced by something harder, something more protective of Sarah and more critical of me. He told me I needed to leave. He said I'd ruined the dinner, and I'd made Sarah uncomfortable and I should go. He said if I cared about him, I'd apologize. He said if I cared about him, I'd accept his choices and his wife and stop trying to interfere. I looked at my brother and I didn't recognize him, or I recognized him. But I recognized how much he'd changed, how much Sarah had changed him. I didn't see the thoughtful, creative person I'd known my whole life. I saw someone who'd been reshaped into Sarah's image of what a partner should be. Compliant, defensive, disconnected from everyone else. I stood up and I left the restaurant. I could hear Sarah saying something to him as I was walking away, probably already working to reframe what had just happened. Probably already positioning herself as the victim and me as the jealous family member trying to come between them. She was probably telling him that they were lucky to have each other, lucky to have found someone so devoted to supporting them. I paid the check on my way out and went home, and I didn't talk to Martin for 3 days. Rebecca called me on the 3rd day. She said Sarah had messaged her saying Martin's family was toxic, that we were trying to come between them, that Martin would have to distance himself if we continued interfering. Sarah had said it like it would be Martin's choice, but we both knew it wouldn't. I told Rebecca about the dinner, how it went badly, how Martin sided with Sarah, how I watched him choose her over his family. Rebecca was quiet. Then she said, maybe that was inevitable. Maybe once someone was manipulated long enough, they couldn't see their way out. Maybe the only thing we could do was let him know we were here if he ever woke up. I told her we couldn't just give up. She said there wasn't anything else, people had to save themselves. You couldn't force someone to recognize abuse. You could explain it until you were exhausted, but if they didn't want to see it, they wouldn't. She said it from experience. She'd been trying to help Martin for years, and he'd consistently chosen not to listen. That was the hardest part of this whole situation. The realization that even with proof, even with family members who loved him and were trying to help, Martin had chosen to stay in the relationship and believe his wife's framing of what was happening. He had accepted her version of events. He'd believed that his family was the problem, not the woman who was systematically dismantling his self-worth and isolating him from everyone who could help him see it. There's a grief that comes with that kind of realization. It's not the same as if he'd died. He was still alive, still in the world, but he'd become unreachable in a way that death might not have made him. At least if he'd died, I could remember him as he was. But this way I had to watch him become someone else and pretend it wasn't happening. About a month after that dinner, I stopped trying. I didn't reach out to Martin. I didn't push. I didn't send him messages or call him. I just let him go. Rebecca and I talked about it. We decided that the best thing we could do was make it clear that we loved him, and we were here if he ever wanted to talk, but we couldn't force him to take help he didn't want. It was a form of acceptance, I guess. A difficult, painful form of acceptance that some people you love will make choices you can't understand and you can't fix, no matter how hard you try, no matter how much evidence you present, no matter how clearly you can see the problem. Rebecca's feelings for Martin didn't go away. I don't think they ever would. She told me that loving someone and being powerless to help them was one of the most painful experiences she'd ever been through. She said it was worse than rejection because there was no clean ending to it. It just lingered. It just ached. I understood that. I felt it too, though differently. I was grieving the brother I used to know, the one who was still in there somewhere underneath all of Sarah's conditioning. By the 6-month mark, we'd heard through mutual friends that Martin and Sarah had moved away. They'd relocated to another province for a job opportunity. That's what the official story was. I sometimes wonder if Sarah had engineered the move to get Martin even further away from anyone who might recognize what was happening. The distance made it easier for her. The isolation became complete. I don't know if that was Sarah's idea, or Martin's, or if it was something they decided together in the way that couples do when one person has complete control over the decision-making process. I don't know if he's happy. I don't know if he's still being manipulated or if he's somehow found a way to make the relationship work. I don't know if he's lost so much of himself that he can't even remember what he wanted before he met her. What I do know is that I gave it my best shot. I presented the evidence. I expressed my concerns. I tried to help. And he chose not to listen. That's something I've had to learn to live with. You can't save people from themselves no matter how much you love them. You can show them the door, but they have to choose to walk through it. Some people would rather stay trapped than admit they made a mistake in who they committed to. Some people would rather believe their abuser than believe their family. The USB drive is still in my possession. I never deleted the footage Michael gave me. Part of me has wanted to send it to Martin anonymously, Like maybe seeing the look on his sister's face as his wedding was happening would somehow make him understand. Maybe if he could see the pain there, the anguish, maybe he'd realize what Rebecca had been trying to tell him. But I know that wouldn't work. He'd just show it to Sarah and she'd reframe it. She'd say Rebecca had been having some kind of emotional breakdown and he'd worry about her instead of examining the relationship he was in. She'd make it about how unstable his sister was instead of what the footage actually showed. So the USB drive just sits in my drawer now, a reminder of how this all started. A reminder that something I thought was about Rebecca's inappropriate feelings turned out to be about so much more. It turned out to be about a family trying to save one of its own from psychological abuse, and failing because the person being abused couldn't see what was happening to him. Looking back now, I wonder if I should have handled things differently. I wonder if there was a better approach, a smarter strategy that might have actually gotten through to Martin. I wonder if I should have waited longer, if I should have presented it differently, if I should have let Rebecca take the lead, instead of trying to be the rational voice in the room. But I also know that's just me trying to find something to blame, besides the simple reality that he made his choice, and I couldn't change his mind. Sometimes people choose their abusers. It's a hard truth to sit with. What I took from this whole experience was a deeper understanding of how insidious control and manipulation can be. I learned that abuse doesn't always look like what you expect it to look like. It doesn't always involve raised voices or visible marks or dramatic confrontations. Sometimes it looks like someone being practical, someone being supportive, someone who just loves you so much that they want to make all your decisions for you and keep you away from anyone who might contradict their version of reality. Sometimes it looks like care, and I learned that you can see it clearly, you can document it, you can explain it to the person living it, and they still might not be able to leave. They might choose to stay. They might choose to believe their abuser instead of the people who love them. That's the part that haunts me now. Not the footage Michael showed me. Not even Rebecca's feelings for her brother, which I now understand were tied to genuine concern rather than romantic obsession. What haunts me is knowing that somewhere out there, Martin is still being systematically broken down by someone who claims to love him. He still doesn't see it. He's living in another province now, far away from anyone who might help him see it. And I was powerless to stop it. We all were. And that's something I have to live with now.